the face of a young woman eyes wide with terror, lips trembling as the cold barrel of a pistol pressed hard against her temple. That was the kind of image no one could ever forget if they had stood on that dusty street that day. A living, breathing human being forced to her knees in the hardened dirt, her dress ripped open before a crowd of onlookers, while a drunken outlaw, stinking of whiskey, shouted, "She's mine today." Ask yourself this. If you had been there, what would you have done? Would you have lowered your eyes and walked away, pretending not to see? Or would you have stepped forward, stared down the gun, and fought for the dignity of someone too weak to fight for herself? Before we dive deeper into this story, let me say this: if you love Western tales that are raw, haunting, and deeply human, don't forget to follow the channel and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. A small gesture, but one that keeps these dusty, blood-soaked stories alive for you. Now back to Dry Creek. Are you ready? Saddle up. The town of Dry Creek sat still beneath the blistering Arizona sun. Its main street, narrow, beaten down, lined with sagging wooden buildings, was more ghost than gathering place. In Dry Creek, law didn't come from books or courts. It came from stares, from reputations, and from fear. And that afternoon, fear ruled. Clara Hayes, 25-year-old daughter of a poor rancher who had died the year before, was forced down on her knees in the cracked dirt. She had no money, no family, nothing left to claim, except the thin shred of dignity she tried to hold on to. But even that was torn from her, as the outlaw's filthy hand ripped her dress wide, leaving her shame exposed to the empty eyes of the crowd. Clara's trembling fingers clawed at the fabric, trying to shield herself, but they were no match for the reeking laughter of a drunkard and the sneers of those who would not lift a hand. "None of you got the guts," the outlaw roared, his voice thick with cheap whiskey. The words echoed down the street, but no one answered. Men shifted uneasily, rifles in their hands but frozen to the ground. Mothers pulled their children inside, shutters slammed shut. Some folks took a step back, hoping that by keeping their distance, the trouble would not touch them. In the midst of it all, Clara felt her own heart pounding so hard it might tear her chest apart. Her throat was sand-dry, her breath shallow as dust, and then, like a final prayer, too fragile to hold back a whisper, slipped past her lips so soft she barely believed she had spoken it. "I'll marry anyone who saves me. Anyone." It wasn't a vow of love. It was a last cry for mercy. A desperate plea that maybe, just maybe, someone would find reason to care. But the audience to her torment, the people of Dry Creek, chose silence. They watched a pistol grind into her skin. They saw the tears streak her face, and they turned away. Their safety mattered more than her life, and in that silence, shame spread like wildfire, staining the whole town. And Clara, what did she feel? Humiliation sharper than any blade. Hatred not only for the outlaw, but for every set of eyes that had turned aside. In that moment, she understood a truth colder than steel to them. She wasn't worth saving. Her father was gone, her land lost, and now even her last shred of dignity was abandoned in the dirt of Dry Creek. And it was in that very moment, when humiliation choked her breath and hatred burned hot in her veins, that fate began to turn. The sound of cowboy boots striking hard-packed earth echoed down the silent street. Clop, clop. Each step rang out against the cowardly hush of the town, like a drumbeat in the chest of anyone listening. A tall figure emerged from the shadow of the blacksmith's shop, broad shoulders beneath a sun-bleached shirt, a wide-brimmed hat casting his weathered face in shade, a low-slung revolver riding easy on his hip, leather worn smooth from years of use. Sheriff Daniel Cade, a true cowboy, walked forward slow and steady, each step sinking into the blistering dirt as if he belonged to it. Clara lifted her tear-blurred eyes and saw that cowboy striding toward her. In the moment when her heart had already surrendered to death, his presence felt like a cool wind cutting through the desert heat. A fragile flicker of light pierced the darkness, swallowing her whole hope. The outlaw, drunk on whiskey and rage, barked through cracked lips, "Back off, cowboy, she's mine today." But Daniel did not stop. his jaw-locked eyes hidden beneath the brim of his hat, one calloused hand resting easy on the worn grip of his gun. He hadn't drawn yet, but the weight of his stillness pressed harder than any threat. The outlaw shifted sweat breaking on his brow. The crowd, those who had turned their faces away, began to steal glances, now trembling with the same thought. Would this cowboy do what none of them had the courage to try? Clara knelt in the dirt chest, rising in shallow, broken breaths. The outlaw's pistol still dug into her temple, but through her terror she saw Daniel's silhouette framed in sunlight, solid and unshaken. In that instant, she dared to believe maybe she had not been abandoned after all. Maybe someone had heard her desperate whisper. Daniel's voice broke the heat-heavy silence, low and steady as old oak let her go. The street seemed to stop breathing. Wind rattled loose shutters. A hinge creaked from somewhere down the row, but no one spoke. The outlaw's laugh cracked the stillness, jagged and mean. "You won't do it, cowboy. None of these folks would. Why should you?" Daniel didn't answer. He had heard words like that before, on battlefields where men tried to bury each other's courage in fear. He knew how fear could freeze an entire line of soldiers. But he also knew this one man willing to act could shatter that fear to dust. And today, in Dry Creek, that man was him. In a heartbeat, stretched thin as eternity, Daniel moved. His hand flashed iron-clearing leather in a blur too fast for the eye. A single shot cracked the silence, tearing it wide open. Smoke curled in the noon sun. The outlaw staggered eyes wide, then collapsed face first into the dust, his gun tumbling useless from his hand. A rush of air swept the crowd. Windows cracked open, timid faces peeked out, watching the end of the man who had terrorized them for only minutes, but left scars deep as years. Still, no one stepped into the street. They stayed hidden, leaving the cowboy to stand alone under the burning sun and the curling smoke of his revolver. Clara collapsed her arms, too weak to hold her weight. Her body shook uncontrollably, breath sharp and ragged. Daniel was there before she hit the dirt, strong arms catching her, lifting her from the ground. Against his chest, she felt the steady beat of his heart, the tang of gunpowder on his clothes. The crushing rope of terror that had bound her chest began to loosen. "Easy now. You're safe." His voice was quiet, but it carried like a vow. Clara leaned into him, her vision blurring as exhaustion stole the last of her strength. Not trust, not yet, but relief, the kind that let her body finally surrender. In the arms of a stranger, a cowboy with a wide-brim hat and steady hands, the faint fire of hope flickered alive. Daniel lifted her, turning from the silent crowd that had betrayed her. Doors shut again, shutters drawn, neighbors hiding behind the lie of safety. But Daniel walked tall, each step a rebuke against their cowardice, carrying her out of the dust and into something more than survival. Clara clutched his shirt weakly, the thought stirring in her chest. Maybe I still have a chance. And in that cowboy's arms beneath the harsh Arizona sun, hope, thin, fragile but real, took its first breath. As Daniel carried Clara out of the dusty street, Dry Creek sealed itself behind him with slamming doors and shuttered windows. That silence wasn't respect. It was a wall of cowardice, thick and suffocating. Before escaping the outlaw's pistol, Clara had thought death was the most terrifying thing. But now, walking away in the sheriff's arms, she realized something just as cruel, the eyes that had turned away the neighbors who had stood still while she knelt in the dirt. Her mind reeled in his arms, the same thought beating over and over. No one else stepped forward. Only him. Shame pressed heavy against her ribs. Every face from the crowd burned into her memory, and she could already hear their whispers that she had brought this on herself, that she was ruined. Daniel's cabin stood a mile from town, a small timber house tucked beneath a pair of old oaks. He laid her down on a bed he hadn't truly slept in since his wife's death. The fire crackled low in the hearth shadows, playing across her bruised arms. He set a tin cup of coffee in her trembling hands, laid out a heel of bread, and said only eat. Her fingers shook so hard the crust broke apart. Every sound outside the clop of a distant horse, the creak of a tree, made her flinch, heart racing. Silence to her was no comfort. It was the storm waiting to break. Daniel didn't press her with questions. He sat near the window revolver resting on the table, eyes scanning the dark like a wolf long used to guarding its den. He'd seen fear like hers before on battlefields in men fresh from near death. He knew she didn't need words. She needed to know someone was watching. That first night, Clara could not sleep. She tossed, haunted by the echo of the outlaw's laugh and the shutters slamming shut. Each time she startled awake, her eyes caught him. Their hat-brim tilted low firelight flickering across his face. He said nothing, but his steady presence was a wall between her and the dark. For the first time in months, she thought, maybe I'm not entirely alone. Morning crept in through the cracks. Daniel had already been up, a fresh cup of coffee set on the table beside another slice of bread. Clara hesitated. Do I deserve this kindness? But hunger won. When she risked a glance at him, she saw no judgment in his eyes, no leering curiosity, no cheap pity. Just calm, just certainty. Finally, her voice broke the quiet. Why did you help me? No one else would? Daniel's gaze met hers, gray and steady. Because I couldn't stand still. He didn't tell her about the war, or the wife buried in hard ground, or the nights when silence had nearly swallowed him whole. But Clara felt that his answer carried more than duty. It was choice, and in that her fear cracked just enough for a sliver of hope to slip through. Still, the shadow of Dry Creek clung to her. She knew what the town would say, that she was the woman dragged into the street, that the sheriff had taken her in, for reasons unfit to name. Rumors could cut deeper than bullets, and Clara dreaded facing their stares. One afternoon, wind rattled the cabin door. Clara flinched, clutching the blanket to her chest. Daniel rose, his boots thudding against the floor, and placed a hand on her shoulder, rough, steady, unyielding. No one will touch you here, just 5 words. But they steadied her heartbeat, feeding the fragile fire of hope inside her chest. The world outside was still cruel, but within these walls, a cowboy stood between her and the darkness. Fear still lingered. Hope still wavered. But from the quiet meals, from the glow of the fire at night, from the firm weight of his hand when the storm rattled her bones, Clara began to believe there might be a different tomorrow. A tomorrow where gunfire and cruel laughter and the town's cowardly silence lived only in memory. On the third night in the cabin, the wind hissed through the cracks like the whistle of unseen ghosts. Clara sat near the fire, wrapped in the oversized shirt Daniel had given her, its hem falling past her knees. In her hands she held a needle and thread, fumbling to mend the torn dress. Each stitch pierced more than cloth, it cut into memory, dragging up every jagged moment that had brought her here. Daniel sat a short distance away, eyes fixed on the flames, his rough fingers resting on the grip of his revolver. He didn't press her with questions, didn't fill the silence with easy words. But the quiet around him felt steady, safe enough for Clara to finally let her voice break through. Her words trembled thin as thread. Before Dry Creek, I went from town to town. I knocked on doors, begged for work, sewing, cooking, cleaning. Anything. But no one would take me. Daniel didn't move, but his shoulders tightened. Clara swallowed hard, forcing herself on. Some men made offers, but not the kind I could accept. When I said no, they laughed. Then the whispers spread faster than fire. By the time I reached the next town, they had already heard the lies. No one wanted to hire a girl with a ruined name. Tears welled in her eyes, shining in the firelight, but she didn't lift a hand to hide them. When that outlaw dragged me into the street, everyone saw, but none of them stepped in. They believed the rumors so easily that I wasn't worth saving. In their eyes, I was nothing. Her voice cracked, splintering into sobs. These were the words she had carried unspoken from one town to the next, each rejection cutting deeper than the last. For a long while, Daniel said nothing, his face shadowed by the flicker of fire. Finally, his voice came low and rough, like wood breaking in the hearth. I know what that feels like. Not the same. But I know what it is to be cast aside." Clara lifted her tear-streaked face toward him. Daniel rarely spoke of himself, but something in the night had loosened the door to his own past. "I was Union cavalry," he said, eyes far away. "Years in the saddle, riding into gunfire, watching men drop one after another. Whole companies erased in minutes while I lived to ride out. Folks call those scars honor. To me, they're stains I'll never wash off." He drew a sharp breath, then continued. "When the war ended, I came home with nothing but ghosts. People didn't want to hear our stories. They wanted to forget. I married, thought I could start again, but 2 winters back, fever took her. Since then, this cabin's been nothing but wood and silence." His voice faltered. The firelight caught lines etched deep into his face, carving the weight of memory into every shadow. Clara's chest ached. His pain was not the same as hers, but it rang with the same notes: abandonment, loss, the cruelty of silence from those who turned away. "I'm sorry," she whispered without thinking. Daniel shook his head, his eyes softening when they found hers. "Don't be. We all carry scars." In that moment, inside 4 plain wooden walls, 2 broken souls found something rare recognition. Not pity, not false comfort, but the simple truth of seeing each other's wounds and allowing them to be real. Clara wiped her cheeks, her hand still trembling, but the needle no longer felt useless. Every stitch she drove into the torn dress meant more than mending fabric. It was a fragile attempt to stitch herself whole. And now she knew there was a man in the room doing the same in his own way, piecing together a life shattered by war and loss. That night when Clara laid her head down, the howl of the wind outside didn't feel quite so consuming. She could hear the steady rhythm of Daniel's breathing near the fire, his shadow still watching over her. For the first time in months, she did not feel alone in her pain. And in that quiet, shared sorrow, the smallest seed of trust took root. The next morning, Clara woke with a feeling she hadn't known in months, not the suffocating fear that had haunted her every dawn, but a fragile hush that almost felt like peace. When she sat up, she saw Daniel at the table carefully cleaning his revolver with the patience of a man long used to discipline. Beside him sat a steaming cup of coffee left there for her. Clara wrapped her hands around the tin cup, sipping slowly. The bitterness spread across her tongue, but it calmed the storm in her chest. For a fleeting moment, she let herself believe danger might not come crashing down again. But then the memory of Dry Creek returned, the sneers, the whispers, the slammed doors. Fear rose up sharp and heavy, not from bullets this time, but from people. "They'll say I brought it on myself," she whispered, voice shaking like a blade against bone. "They'll blame me. And then it'll only get worse." Daniel looked up, his gray eyes locked on hers, steady as stone. He set the revolver down, his words deliberate. "No one touches you. No one." She wanted to believe him, but the fear inside her was thick as fog. Her fingers knotted in the hem of the shirt he had given her. "You don't understand. They'll whisper, they'll say I deserved it. And if someone tries to hurt me again, the whole town will turn away, just like before." Daniel rose to his feet, crossing the space between them. He didn't reach for her, only stood tall, a wall of flesh and resolve. "I've heard whispers my whole life, Clara. Folks said I survived the war because I was a coward, that I wasn't fit to wear this badge. But I'm still standing. And now hear me. No one, not a word, not a hand, will decide your worth." In the flicker of firelight, Clara saw not only resolve in his face, but a quiet pride. Not pride in himself, but in the cause he had chosen to defend. Tears stung her eyes. She hated feeling weak, trembling, yet part of her felt lifted, steadied, as if he wasn't just fighting the town, but the darkness lodged deep inside her. Why, she whispered, voice-breaking, "Why do you care that much?" Daniel paused, then lowered himself into the chair beside her. His hand rested open on the table like an unspoken vow. "Because if I don't, then who will law doesn't mean a damn thing if we let the weak be trampled. I won't let it happen again." The words sank into her like anchors. The fear hadn't vanished, but it shifted, driven back by something stronger: trust. A new feeling, trembling but sweet, took root inside her chest. That day, Daniel worked outside splitting wood, while Clara stayed in the cabin sweeping floors and preparing a simple meal. Each strike of his axe rang through the yard, and every sound steadied her. It was more than labor. It was a reminder that someone stood watch, keeping her fragile safety alive. When he came back in, shirt damp with sweat, Clara hurried forward with a basin of water. For the first time, her fingers brushed against his arm as she steadied him. Her pulse leapt, but she didn't pull away. Her eyes caught on the long scar down his forearm, and for a heartbeat, both of them stood silent. The smallest spark of trust passed between them, quiet but undeniable. That evening, she sat sewing again, while Daniel kept his usual post near the window revolver within reach. But when the wind rattled the door and Clara startled, he didn't speak. He only moved his chair closer. That small gesture, closing the distance, carried more weight than any promise. She looked at him, lips trembling. "I've never felt safe like this." Daniel said nothing. He only nodded once, eyes soft. But in his silence, Clara heard it clear as any oath he would never let her face this alone again. And in that small cabin beneath the unforgiving Arizona sky, fear still lingered. But trust had begun to grow fragile, yet fierce like a seed pushing through hard earth, reaching for light. In the nights that followed, the little cabin seemed to find a new rhythm, not the tense silence of strangers, but a quieter stillness that left room for trust to settle in. Daniel still kept his chair by the window revolver, within easy reach, eyes scanning the dark. But Clara, instead of curling into herself beneath the blanket, began to sleep more soundly. At times, half dreaming, she would open her eyes and see his silhouette against the flicker of firelight. That familiar shape calmed her like an anchor holding her against the pull of nightmares. One night she rolled slightly and saw him there, hand resting on his revolver, even as his eyes drooped with fatigue. In her drowsy haze, her voice slipped out, soft as a whisper. "You don't have to stay awake for me." Daniel opened his eyes. His reply low and steady, like a stream moving slow and sure. "I'm used to it. You'll sleep easier knowing I'm here." Clara fell silent. The simple words weren't just fact. They were proof he cared about her peace of mind. Warmth spread through her chest, softening scars that fear had carved so deep. Days rolled on, and Clara found herself adjusting to his presence. Each morning a cup of coffee waited on the table sometimes, with a slice of bread saved aside for her. Each afternoon, while Daniel worked outside, splitting wood or checking fences, Clara would linger in the doorway, quietly watching him. The tall frame beneath a sun-faded shirt, the cowboy hat tilted low against the glare, the steady, deliberate swing of the axe, all etched into her memory as a rare sense of security. For Daniel, something shifted too, though he resisted naming it. At first he told himself this was duty, a sheriff's task, to guard the vulnerable. But more and more he caught himself looking back, not to check the shadows, but to see her. The smallest things, her bent head over a needle, the flush in her cheeks when she offered him a basin of water lodged in him deeper than he expected. One evening, Daniel stepped inside with an armful of wood and found Clara by the window bent over her mending. The light of sunset fell across her hair, catching in the strands, while her thin fingers struggled carefully with the fabric. He stopped in the doorway longer than usual, not out of pity, but because he saw in her persistence a strength that demanded respect. When Clara lifted her head, she caught his gaze and blushed. Neither spoke, but in that shared silence, something between them had undeniably shifted. That night, as Daniel moved to take his usual chair, Clara hesitated before speaking. "You could sit a little closer, if you'd like." Daniel paused, hand tightening on the chair's back. He studied her for a moment, eyes lit by the fire, then pulled the chair nearer to her bed. He set the revolver on the small table beside her, instead of across the room. The distance between them shrank to a single arm's reach. Clara turned her face away, her heart racing, but a small smile tugged at her lips. That night she slept without startling awake. From then on the habit shifted. His chair edged closer each night until one evening Clara's voice broke the quiet, trembling yet resolute. "You don't have to sit in the chair anymore. There's room here." For a long moment Daniel didn't move. His vow to himself that he would never open his heart again echoed inside him. But when he met her gaze, fragile yet brave, the wall he had carried for years cracked. Slowly he removed his hat, tugged off his boots, and sat at the edge of the bed. Clara slid over, leaving space. No words passed, but when her fingers reached hesitantly for his rough hand, he didn't pull back. He closed his hand over hers, firm, warm, steady. In that quiet, something unspoken was finally admitted. What lay between them was no longer obligation. It was choice. And from that choice, a tender warmth began to take root, a flame flickering in the hearth, and in their hearts lighting a cabin that had once been nothing but silence and loss. One evening, when the fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers, Clara sat quietly on the bed, her eyes fixed on the shadows across the room. Daniel sat close by, straight-backed, as always, his hand resting loosely on his knee. To anyone else, the cabin seemed peaceful. But inside, Clara worry knotted tight, pulling harder with every breath. Since the day he had saved her through every night, he had kept watch. One question had haunted her without rest. Did he do all this only because of the desperate promise she had whispered in the street? She drew a shaky breath, clutching the blanket in her hands, and finally forced the words out, her voice trembling. "Daniel, that day I said I'd marry anyone who saved me. I'm afraid you've done all of this because you think I owe you, that I belong to you, because of what I said." The words cut through the quiet like a blade. Clara's heart pounded, her chest aching. She feared she had shattered the fragile warmth between them. Daniel didn't answer at once. He turned toward the fire, his jaw tightening, his eyes heavy with thoughts she couldn't read. The silence stretched, and dread filled her. She braced for disappointment, for rejection, for the cold truth that it had all been duty. Then Daniel turned back his gray eyes, catching the glow of the embers steady and clear. His voice was deep, firm. "I didn't draw that gun because of a promise. I acted because a man held a pistol to a woman's head in broad daylight. I couldn't stand still." Clara's breath caught her fear loosening in her chest. Daniel paused, then continued, his voice slower, weighted with honesty. "I haven't kept you here out of debt. I've kept you because I want to." The words struck her like stones dropped in still water, rippling outward until her whole being trembled. Her hands shook, and without thinking she reached out, laying her fingers on his. Daniel looked down at the fragile hand resting on his rough one. This time he didn't pull away. He turned his palm and clasped hers firmly. No vows, no papers, just the warmth of two hands joined a quiet but undeniable truth. For a long moment they stayed that way. Then Clara lifted her gaze, eyes shining with tears and light lips quivering. "So, you don't think I owe you anything?" Daniel shook his head gently, his eyes softening in a way they rarely did. "No, I don't want you here because of duty. I want you here because of you." The words lodged deep inside her, and a trembling smile broke across her face, fragile but free. The weight of shame and fear that had chained her for so long began to fall away. And in that moment, Clara leaned forward, pressing her lips to his. It was not a desperate kiss, but a trembling confession, a test of truth. Daniel froze for a heartbeat, memory clawing at him, the ghost of his late wife flickering in his mind. But then gently he slid an arm around Clara's back and returned the kiss, tenderly, with a care he thought he had buried forever. It was not obligation. It was choice. When they parted, Clara rested her forehead against his chest, breath, unsteady, eyes closed tight. In her heart rose a rush of feelings, unexpected, overwhelming, but bright with happiness. He hadn't saved her for a debt. He had stayed for her. Daniel tightened his arm around her, silent, but in that silence he admitted what he had denied. For years his heart was opening again. not to replace what was lost, but to begin something new. That night, as Clara drifted into sleep in his arms, the cabin no longer felt like a cold shelter haunted by ghosts. It had become the beginning of something tender and real affection born of honesty, warmed by choice glowing like the fire in the hearth. Small, fragile, but strong enough to push back the dark. Spring crept slowly across Arizona. After months of biting cold warm winds carried the scent of wild grass and fresh earth. For Clara, each day in Daniel's cabin no longer felt like a string of fears, but like pieces of a new life stitched together with hope. Cracks in the porch were mended, the hearth filled with simple meals and soft laughter, and in her heart a seed of belonging, something she had never dared to dream, began to grow. But out in Dry Creek, whispers still lingered. Women cast sharp glances as Clara walked by. Men smirked, trading knowing looks. They had not forgotten the scene in the dusty street that day, and they took pleasure in twisting the knife. Yet Clara no longer lowered her eyes. Because Daniel's hand was openly laced with hers, his grip steady, daring anyone to speak. One Sunday morning they walked from the small church at the end of town. Behind them, voices stirred. That's her, the one the sheriff carried out of the dirt. Clara stiffened, shame threatening to choke her. But Daniel's hand tightened his eyes, never turning to the crowd, only to her. "You ready?" he asked. And in that steady gaze she saw a trust no rumor could undo. Clara nodded, and for the first time in months tears filled her eyes, not from pain, but from pride. That evening, back in the cabin, Daniel set his revolver aside. He wore no hat, no badge, just a man, roughened hands holding hers across the table. His voice was low, worn, but unshakable. "Clara, that day, you said you'd marry anyone who saved you. I never wanted that to bind you to me. But tonight, I'm asking, because I want you, not out of duty, not because of what happened in the street. I choose you." Her lips trembled, tears spilling freely. "I'm not marrying you because you saved me, Daniel. I'm marrying you because you stayed." The words tore away the last of the distance between them. Daniel pulled her into his arms, their kiss no longer hesitant or uncertain, but whole steady sealing what neither of them had dared to say. Until now. And so without paper or priest, under the witness of wind and desert earth, they became husband and wife. They didn't need Dry Creek's approval. Their choice was enough. In the days that followed, a new rhythm settled into their lives. Clara cooked and tended the hearth, planted seeds in the soil outside the cabin, where nothing had grown in years. Daniel repaired the roof-rebuilt fences and returned each night to the smell of food and the warmth of home. The silence that had once haunted the cabin now rang with conversation, with laughter, with life. Then one morning, Clara pressed her hand to her belly, eyes wide with wonder. When she told Daniel, he went still, then dropped to his knees, his rough palm covering hers. His smile, rare, deep, unguarded, spread across his face, and for him it was more than the promise of a child. It was the promise of life renewed, a second chance he had never believed he'd be given. News trickled back into Dry Creek. Whispers rose again, but this time behind them was something else: respect, or at least the fear of speaking too loudly against a man who no longer hid his devotion. And Clara, once bowed by shame, now walked with her chin high. She was no longer the woman dragged into the street. She was the sheriff's wife, and more than that, she was a woman chosen, loved, and reborn. Theirs was not a fairy tale. It was the story of two broken souls who refused to stay broken. Clara, once kneeling in the dirt, now stood as wife and soon-to-be mother. Daniel, once a man who had buried his heart, found it alive again, beating stronger for her. Together they forged not perfection, but something far more enduring: family. And as spring settled in fully, the cabin echoed with new sounds. The creak of Daniel's saw the chirp of birds outside the window, the softer tread of Clara's steps across the floor. Out on the porch, her patched dress replaced with a new one Daniel had bought in town. She rested her hand on the life stirring within her. Daniel stood behind, arms circling her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. Together they looked out at the land, hard, unforgiving, but theirs. The question now is not whether they survived, it's what comes next. Dry Creek remains a harsh place, and the West is full of dangers yet unseen. But one truth is certain: whatever comes, they will face it side by side. And now, I want to ask you, if you were there, would you stand with them? Would you remain silent like Dry Creek did that day? Or would you lend your support to a couple who dared to rise from ruin? Show your voice for Daniel and Clara. Let them know their fight, their love, their rebirth matters. Because sometimes, even in the toughest of lands, a single word of support is enough to keep hope alive. So what do you say? Are you ready to ride alongside them on this new trail? Saddle Up, the journey isn't over, and every ride is a Western worth remembering.